And so here we are, at the edge of the world, on the brink of something, waiting for a political revolution, waiting for what is to be something that was, to watch that crumbling infrastructure, to watch how we respond to it, to see how we rebuild, and to see exactly what comes next in the chapter for humanity. Last time I had left off chapter 19, verse 9. And I recommend to myself, or for whomever may find this recording, to refer back to that last episode, part 1, of my commentary on 19. Because I've noticed that there is a repeating pattern in this verse, or in this chapter, I should say, and it made me wonder about the totality of the book of Proverbs, that perhaps there are patterns for which I cannot see, and so is life, right? There are many things that we don't pick up on. We can observe any number of things and yet not quite understand what we are seeing. But there's a common theme in the book of Proverbs where there will be a verse that is repeated. Usually it's not in the same chapter. Usually it's in the adjacent chapter, or if one is paying close attention, they know that they will have seen it before, just as they perhaps have heard a particular piece of a song, of a pop song, and it's not until they are explicitly sitting down to examine that song that they realize it. A similar phenomena, I think, is happening here in chapter 19, because verse 5 and verse 9 are similar. They're not the same. And there's a couple other chapters in the Proverbs that represent some continuity within the chapter itself. That the verses have their own individual meaning, but they also have some common thread through the entire chapter, verse by verse. And I think chapter 19 is not quite this way, but I think there is a threaded pattern. And when I say it's not quite, I mean it's not explicitly so. It's not... in one of the early chapters, there's an example of a woman that is warning a city of potential doom. She is sort of the judge. She is this embodiment of wisdom that appears at the gates. And the verse sort of proceeds from there, and it's sort of her oration about the matter. Chapter 19 is not that kind of chapter. But insofar as we see a repeating verse within the chapter, that seems to be somewhat new. And so I spent a not an insignificant amount of time in part 1 trying to determine what the through line between the verses that we have read so far and verse 9 is. Verse 9 reads, "A false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall perish." Verse 5, "A false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall not escape." Now there are 3 hours worth of my commentary on the first 8 verses. There's a lot of ground that was covered there. But in summary, I'll say this. We continue to deal in the realm of transcendence. We continue with our analogy of the staircase, and that every step of this staircase is an opportunity for us, whether it be collectively or the individual, to make a choice, to make a sacrifice, and to accept the way that things must be, to choose the right path. And oftentimes, this path is clouded by our imperfect judgment. And sometimes we make sacrifices that are not correct. And it forces us to reckon with the difficulties associated with transcendence. Now, thus far, I have expanded this illustration a little bit. And I have been thinking about what is required in order for man to ascend this staircase. Now, the word that immediately comes to mind is discernment. Discernment in all facets. Now, I spent time talking about language. I talked some time about that of relativism. I talked a little bit about things and their opposites, sort of paying homage to Plato. And one commonality I think that is seen in chapter 19 is the aspect of discernment. We have a few verses that are related to relationships among men. We have consideration about what our relationships are based on. There's discussion of the nature of poverty, of the nature of friendship, what it means to have a superficial bond. More importantly, what creates a solid bond between people, not just between people, but within the very language that we use to communicate. The analogy, the metaphor that I used was the hearth, this centerpiece around which we all dance and commune to establish relationships, to discuss things, to exercise that muscle of discernment. Of the hearth, I also spoke of the different elements that can come into consolidation around this hearth. Not only individuals, but also sort of in an abstract sense, our language does this dance around the hearth. Our language the hearth, I should say, affords our language the opportunity through the mobilization of culture and custom to find its home, to find its meaning, to give itself identity. And since it is grounded, since it is, in some sense, again, in an abstract sense, it's of the hearth, but also separate and distinct from the hearth. I think in my last episode, I had described a dynamic relationship between man and the hearth. Now, I think that in order to to prevent from some confusion about where I'm going here, I'm using man as sort of the fundamental piece here, because without man, language wouldn't necessarily be connected to the hearth. It requires man in his mind for language to be utilized in such a way, to be used as this sort of interface with the world and the reality as we perceive it. Language is an extension of man and his ability. And so when I compare language to the hearth, I'm comparing it through man into that extension. Now we can go farther, and we can say of language, we can say of individual words. So it's piercing through all of those layers. Now the words, the word of importance here in verse 9, a false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall perish. Witness is the fundamental word that I revolved around in the last episode. And I described the hearth as this sort of pillar, this stake in the ground, if you will, that holds, that binds. And it is something that is drawn, pierced through that word in some sense, such that it binds, just like a stake is forced into the ground to hold down something. In my mind, I'm thinking of a tent. We nail the stakes into the ground to hold that fabric or whatever sturdy so it doesn't blow away. In this way, in this manner, the hearth finds itself pierced through man and all of that extension of him, including his language, including the words. And I think that I had described this as sort of in a Platonic manner. I'd sort of taken man out of the equation because it was useful to talk about language, and I don't mean to go back on that at all. I think that's a still useful frame. And so, of man and his language, of this word, witness, we imagine that the stake of the hearth has pierced through that word, witness. And now it is bound to something. It is bound to some home. It is bound to that fireplace. It is bound to that thing that facilitates its meaning. In some sense, it allows it to be. If it were not drawn down to a not necessarily a point, but if it was not sufficiently localized, it would not be something that's able to be identified. If you can't identify it, it's just sort of a breeze. It's a gust of wind. It's something intangible. It's something that can't really be true. It's all of the meaning in our language would be completely relative. Now, of course, there's an extension of this conversation that's a little annoying, and I don't really want to go there. Because culture has this relativism in it, but it finds its truth as it, again, dances around the hearth, which is why the hearth is so fundamental. And this dynamism is key, because the word itself, witness, like many words, we could say one thing of it, but we can also play with it, we can mold it. It's one of the reasons that our words have not necessarily stayed consistent. Now, there's a degree of consistency, but many words have gained meaning, many words have lost meaning, many words have gone extinct, many words have been produced. This is just the way of things. And part of that, if not all of that, is its relationship to the hearth. And again, I want to bring back the image of this through line that extends through man, through his mind, into his linguistic abilities, into each and every one of his words. Now, this witness, specifically, I submit has a degree of inwardness and outwardness. That meaning, one could witness and observe events, feelings, experiences from within, And they can also observe experiences that are external to themselves, that happen outside of themselves. And it's not necessarily, except under the condition of particular illustrations, that is, some fixed point in time. If we get rid of time, and we just say existence as it is, as it continues to move forth, although I am consciously aware of time, my body continues to age, my mind continues to age, my time that I have with my consciousness expressed through the filter of my neural substructure is decreasing. But putting that aside, setting aside that selfish imposition on reality of the importance of myself, and I analyze my experience as it is, time seemingly becomes less of an important variable. Now, there's no way I can completely obliterate it, I think, from my mind. Perhaps there are some that do. Perhaps there are some that consider that to be enlightenment to a degree. But insofar as I can imagine at this moment, what existing is, I think it's probably best to utilize, to discuss the word witness without the strict barriers of that which may occur completely outside of him and that which may occur completely inside of him. Now, that's not to say that they are not useful conceptions. They certainly are, especially when we are analyzing particular scenarios, such as the stereotypical witness who observes a crime and must remember what they had seen, relay it to within the courtroom to the judge and the jury, etc. But at this moment I am witnessing. I am constantly observing. I'm observing myself. I'm observing the world. In some sense, witnessing is gathering information. And it's not necessarily dependent on the external or the internal. It is dependent, I think, on experience. And again, if we subtract time from that variable, from that conscious experience as much as we can, and if we sacrifice that aspect of the self that wishes to witness the world from their vantage point alone, how it can greater serve their interests. I think the wonder and the beauty that we are exposing ourselves to is much reduced compared to that version of the human being that sacrifices a portion of himself, that remains humble and open to that which is unknown. The precursor of wisdom, of course, is the open ear. Now, it doesn't mean that just because one is open and receptive, that one should accept every single bit of information as true. There's a difference between humility and naivety. But the reason I'm making this distinction, because if we place the word false in front of witness, what we think is What we think of as false is something that is untrue, the opposite of that which is true. And again, we consider that of a witness, that of somebody that is just experiencing, that some conscious mind is experiencing. I think we get closer and closer to the fundamental level, in which a man that is falsely experiencing is one that will be punished. Or as the verse says, a false witness shall not be unpunished. And so what we see here, the question of what we see here, what we see over and over in the Proverbs, is how do we properly orient ourselves? And I think that to the degree that I can make it a connection, again, my goal here in the second part was to establish the connection, to identify the pattern between verse 5 and verse 9, which are very similar. They only differ in the second half. In verse 5, a false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall not escape. A false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall perish. Almost the same, not entirely. They are both preceded, and in the case of verse 5, proceeded. And since I have not read past verse 9, well, I have in the introduction, but since I haven't explored them in any depth, I can't necessarily say if the verses after verse 9 contain this pattern that I'm about to identify. But nonetheless, when we are considering experience, the verses that we have seen thus far, as in the first as in the second, have been a prompting to honesty, has been a prompting towards integrity. It has been a prompting to truthfulness in such a sense that one is open to receive it. Again, that when it enters into that self, the self is constituted, it is oriented in such a way that the truth is able to find a fertile substrate. The fertile substrate is the soul of man. As it grows within him, so too grows his soul. We have a warning against foolishness in the way that can disrupt the mind and its relation to that unity, to that totality, to that firmness of understanding. We have a prompting towards, in a rather sophisticated manner, that of division and of unity. And we think about these things fractally. And so we could think of them microcosm up to the macrocosm. And I think that there is a lot of interesting work that can be done in that sphere among individuals that find themselves around that same hearth. Now that hearth, I'm thinking of a familial exploration of that side of life, that type of discerning conversation, such that they can enter into such an interpersonal space and sphere and unpack that superficiality that, again, we were warned against, that can pervert relationships, that can over time calcify and that can be the thing that forms bonds between people. But that calcification is weak. It's a veneer. It can shatter just like a piece of glass, or a very thin piece of porcelain, perhaps. And when it shatters, when we find disunity, there again we find an opportunity for integrity to take hold, for that honesty to take place. He pursueth them with words, yet they are wanting to him. That part of that verse comes to mind. Again, that's verse 7. The whole verse is, all the brethren of the poor do hate him. How much more do his friends go far from him? He pursues them with words, yet they are wanting to him. Verse 8, he getteth wisdom, loveth his own soul. He that getteth wisdom loveth his own soul. He that keepeth understanding shall find good. Getting and keeping. It is the hearing and retention. All of this is wound up, I think, in the character of witness, of experience. And if man is going to be an effective being to himself and also to others, this balance, this discerning element by which he constitutes himself to the world so that he may see it, so that he is properly oriented to it, and again to the people beside him, must be worked out. Exercise and working out is a perfect analogy. That working out of the unknown, the bringing together of the broken pieces of that porcelain, which are undoubtedly going to occur in life. That's a given. It is about understanding the importance of that earth, of that stake that is driven into the ground around which we have some security, because we come together in order to discover, in order to dream, in order to be secure. And I think within the fractal, we find ourselves, if we are going to combine, I think we have three major illustrations here. One is the hearth, one is the staircase of transcendence, the other is the path to God. This is the mountain, the wide base, narrow peak. All three of these must be in relation. All three of them involve the individual. All three of them involve people outside of us, of the various layers of conscious movement, whether it be whatever the group might be, from the individual to the family to the neighborhood to the community to the city to the state to the nation as a whole. Every single aspect that we can imagine, we will find these three elements. And if we were to combine, let's say for the sake of exploration, if we were going to combine the analogy of the transcendent staircase to that of the hearth, I think the hearth, even though one can transcend their circumstance without a hearth, a hearth makes it much more, much easier. Easier is not the right word. It makes it much more, it facilitates. It facilitates. Now, probabilistically, why is that the case? I'm not so sure. I'm not a mathematician. But I think, now there should be a disclaimer here, I do think that the institutions that we found are always open to corruption and perversion, just like the individual person is. And unfortunately, not every family will find themselves oriented around that hearth that we talk about. Not all families are perfect. Some are quite disharmonious. But to the degree to which a person is going to find stability in life, they will have to find that hearth to dance around, that place of stability, around which they can afford themselves the opportunity to bring together their various disunities, to break apart old, solidified, calcified, superficial ideas or bonds, to reorient them, to reconstitute them, and all along the way making the sacrifices necessary to do so. And this extends certainly well beyond personal relations. This can extend into individual behavior, of discipline, of faith, the reason why should I do this or do that? And I think in this way, this facilitatory apparatus that the hearth provides us, it facilitates our transcendence. And so it's not necessarily an ease, because the process of transcendence, I think, is anything but easy. Certain levels perhaps are easier than others, and I don't think it's consistent throughout the levels. Some levels may be more difficult than others. It's not as though a level that is much higher on that staircase is more difficult than a level much lower on the staircase. Nor is it the case that a level lower on the staircase is easier than a level higher on the staircase. We are presented with opportunities for change at both inopportune moments as well as opportune ones. And it is up to us to recognize and to work through those things. And so a false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall perish. This is a warning against falsehood. It's a warning against disunity. It's a warning about foolishness, of wickedness, of evil, of the lack of prudence. Delight is not seemingly for a fool, much less for a servant to have rule over princes. Now of the fool, this is somebody who is inattentive. They are silly. They are, perhaps we can say of them that they are stupid. Perhaps not mentally incapable, but just inattentive, not concerned about fine things. The general ceiling that we all have on our ability, our perception, that is movable, it is adjustable, it is transcendable. And the foolish person, they care not about this sort of thing, this experience. They are concerned with base desires and pleasures, and that which satisfies them to that degree is enough. Now, delight, certainly, I think, can find itself within somebody that experiences or satisfies their base desires. So the question is, well, if we are to say delight in a certain sense, in a certain light, without falling into relativism, and if we are to use the experience that we gained from the last few verses and imagine the hearth that goes through, again, our minds into this word, the word delight. If what the fool calls delight is not delight, then the question is, well, what is this delight? And how is it foreign to that of the foolish person? Because as I've said, it's certainly the case that a foolish person is able to experience something that is akin to delight, but perhaps in their experience of the lowly, what they consider to be delight is a facade. Perhaps it doesn't reach a certain threshold for which one can consider it delight. Now, I think that this question is a bit unkind, but also what I'm about to say is in the same vein, that I think that this verse is imprecise. I don't think that it's wrong, but it's imprecise. It's imprecise in the sense that it says delight is not seemingly for a fool. Doesn't mean that a fool cannot experience delight, but I think because of our how we've been forming an understanding of how to understand language, of how to understand our orientation with our limited perception, and all of the falsehoods and misconceptions that can bring about our own understanding to the world, of the world. The verse is suggesting that since a fool is somebody that doesn't really appreciate this side of things, that doesn't engage in this level of discernment, they're saying then that true delight, or the delight that comes in from hard work and a sophisticated, perhaps we could say, procedure, this does not, again, concern the fool. And perhaps even the fool is antagonistic to this. They deny at their peril. They are the contrarian. Now, just looking at the word delight, I'm reading that it comes from the Latin word delectare, which means to charm or to please. I'm reading also that it is a certain type of word that expresses a repeated action. The word is thought to be derived further from a proto-Italic word, lakjo, if I'm saying that right, which means to draw or to pull. And the source is saying that delight is ultimately related to the idea of being drawn or attracted to something. And when used as a noun, it refers to a high degree of pleasure or enjoyment. Now we can also break this word down into the prefix and suffix, de being down or away, light being some source. I've been describing, here it says source of happiness or pleasure, but I think that has something to do with the conception of the word, the cultural conception of the word. I take source, certainly, out of light. In the Proverbs and the Psalms, Genesis, throughout the Old Testament, we are seeing the symbol of light that is used. It is something of a symbol of God's presence. The emanatory capacity of man to come to some conclusion that is correct despite without having to examine the elements that make it up. It is seemingly something that comes down on high, from on high. And so this delight, it is literally seeming to imply this down from some source of light. The light is coming down from some source. And so in this way, if we plug in, if the light that comes down from the central source, or I should say, the light that comes down from the central source is not seemingly for a fool, much less a servant, to have rule over princes. And I think this verse further describes an orientation, the orientation to that emanatory capacity of man's mind. Now, I think that this emanation ought not to be placed within, let's say, an oracle type of situation. I think it remains in proper care if it's around the hearth, where it is continually discussed and debated and formed and shaped, molded under the pressure of interaction and of relation. And I say that because in all cases we want to test what is known, and we don't want to jump to conclusions. And I think the verse points to this in an indirect way when it says, well, the fool and the servant are two particular types of individual. In one case, the fool is this willful ignoramus. They would not attend to the light that comes down to them from on high. They would not have the discipline to commit themselves to the sophistication of understanding that is necessary to appreciate this delight. The second half of that verse, I think, is a little bit more illustrative, in which it gives us a direct comparison, that of the servant to that of the prince. And although we don't necessarily think of these terms in these terms anymore, I think we can understand what the qualities of the servant class must have been. Certainly, we have a servant class in society today, in the open, free society today. Now, the servant class is more mobile, perhaps, than days past. There is a lot of opportunity to move up or to move down into the class. But that aside, the class remains. I think it's a part of every society, whether it be because it is fundamentally made up of individuals with limited ability, whether it's made up of individuals of unfortunate circumstance. We can find probably a fair number of reasons why this class of individuals exists. But insofar as the fundamental qualities of this class are concerned, it is likely, at least in the instance that we can consider somebody servant-like, perhaps even if they possess the capability, and maybe they're not limited by pure natural constraints, like limited cognitive ability. If they are perhaps under the fog of an unfortunate upbringing, but all else being within average, and as a result within ability to do well for oneself. Even if it is this case, if we take the snapshot in time before they embarked on some magnificent transcendent adventure, which perhaps some, given unfortunate circumstances, never do, due to the lack of that delight. If we take the snapshot of where they are in their servanthood, certainly we would appreciate and understand that placing a person like this in a position of leadership would be unwise. It would be imprudent. And it would be that way for a number of reasons. Lack of experience, lack of certain characteristics, perhaps lack of discipline, lack of sufficient knowledge, an expansive worldview. All of these sorts of things go into it. Perhaps the thing that is a bit frustrating about this verse, although certainly is true, is the imprecision, but that first part of the verse, delight is not seemingly for a fool. And I would have to wonder, perhaps I'm being a bit too soft here, but again, barring some extreme circumstance, situation, the fool and the servant are able to follow the same path of transcendence as the rest of us. But I can see, if I imagine this servanthood and this foolishness, certainly I can imagine myself as an adolescent, or I can imagine myself 5 years ago, for that matter. I see myself much more ignorant, perhaps more arrogant as well, less disciplined, selfish, damned in a certain sense, foolish, servile. And yet now, after certain commitments, after certain sacrifices, I don't necessarily feel like a fool. Certainly I may behave foolish. And certainly I don't find myself in a position of like that of a prince, let's say. But I also don't consider myself to be a servant to another man, servant certainly to that divine peak. But my questioning about perhaps the roughness or imprecision of the verse, perhaps I'm mistaken, such that we are talking about a quality. We're talking about this quality that exists within that identification. It says nothing of the identification that can be transcended. Now, obviously, there are certain identities for which they are fixed completely. And perhaps there is a degree of foolishness or a degree of servileness that is unable, that is unlikely to be transcended in somebody's life. In any case, we can still take this delight in its relationship to those who deny or do not take the opportunity to accept that light from above. We can take this and put it in our pocket. It's certainly a useful illustration. The discretion of a man deferreth his anger, and it is his glory to pass over a transgression. Now, there are a bunch of things to say here. And let's see where to start. Start with the first half, like we always do. The discretion of a man deferreth his anger. Okay. So discretion. This is his opinion, his capacity to sift through things, to make decisions. Somewhat, in some sense, in my mind, it's related to judgment. It is the opportunity, it is the freedom to make a choice. That thing, that ability of his, that discretion of a man, that thing defers his anger. It's up to him to choose that path of deferral, which means to put off. And I think that there is within that word defer to put off to a future date. But I don't think it means to defer it so that you can come back to it, so that you can strategically use that anger as a club and beat somebody over the head with it for their transgression. Because the second verse says, "And it is his glory to pass over a transgression." It's an interesting thing to say. And it is his glory to pass over a transgression. Now, glory, this is something that we could say that you experience in the light of transcendence as you move up that heavenly ladder towards that divine peak, towards a greater understanding. So how in the world does he get glory when he passes over a transgression? Especially when that transgression, when he has been justly transgressed, it has been proven without a doubt, beyond his mind, perhaps with witnesses standing around. Now we could take any number of transgressions, of course. It is his glory to pass over a transgression. Now the key here is to pass over, not to pass by. For to pass by something, it is to remain on that horizontal, as one that is just moving right past a transgression. And a transgression, we have to remember, is the crossing over from one to another. It is the penetration of a boundary that ought not to have been crossed. So an interesting question is, well, what exactly is that boundary that in this situation somebody has transgressed? Well, it could be any number of illustrations, any number of examples. That is why the Proverbs afford us the luxury of being an artist. We can apply it to our own experiences, we can apply it to somebody else's experiences, but nonetheless we are prompted that we paint upon that canvas. Now, I'm not too interested at this moment in painting a specific illustration. Now, I am interested in painting. I am interested in taking the advice of the Proverbs, the prompting of the Proverbs to be this creative entity. I am listening such that I want to remember, I want to know, I want to understand. And in the Vervaekian language, I want to create this salience landscape. The salience landscape is no doubt the same as the illustration of the blank canvas upon which I can paint. Moreover from that, continuing in the Vervaekian landscape, this combinatorially explosive issue that we all face, of all of the possible examples, circumstances, situations that we can pluck out of our experience or of our observation and plaster onto that canvas. We have to pick one. to center ourselves on. Now, as we do this, as we go through that process, we go through the illustration, we find something that's salient, because we have sifted through it. In the Platonic sense, we have taken our ball of wax and we have detailed into that ball of wax the form and its shape. The more detailed it is, the stronger it is imprinted into our minds. But I would like to try to do something different. Instead of a particular situation, a particular context, I would like to talk about the nature of transgression. Now, perhaps it's inevitable that I'll come to some analogy or some illustration, some specific instance in which a man is angered by some other person's transgression or of his own transgression. I'm concerned about the man, no doubt. I'm concerned about how he passes over this transgression. So I'll return again to that boundary. The boundary that is assumed by using the words transgress, meaning to step beyond, to go beyond. And it implies to go beyond something that has been in place. Now, of this thing, this boundary that has been in place, why is it there? Now, there's two things that I would like to say at the outset, and that is the boundary could be there artificially, or it could be there justly, and perhaps immovably. But then that raises a third point, which comes to mind, which is in relation to the hearth, and the experience therein of the relational, and of the moldability. But it's not mobility to the absolute. It is not pliability to the absolute. It's not relative. It's not a relative boundary. It is moldable in the sense that given certain constraints, it will appear differently. Just like certain constraints from a political perspective will make the spirit of liberty appear differently. Sometimes man fights for his liberty against a tyrannical institution that has been established under blood relations, an institution of hereditary succession. Sometimes his liberation is more insidious, it's from within. Sometimes his liberation is from a corporate enterprise or from an abusive partner. In all of these cases, it is not necessarily that liberty is relative, but the way in which this liberation is expressed is different, and thereby the boundaries and the conditions upon which he is to be liberated depends on the context. It depends on those restraints. Because I think we can, although we can make equivalence between that of a tyrannical government and that of a tyrannical selfishness, perhaps, a selfish worldview, perhaps. The way in which that problem is solved, it looks quite different. And that again is because the restraints are different. Now, in this territory is where I'd like to set up camp. Because within the territory of constraint recognition, I think we are afforded a degree of precision that certainly is lacking in the modern context. Because if we can identify that we have been transgressed, but we are not exactly sure where the boundary is, then it will be impossible, I would argue, to pass over that transgression. Because, to reiterate, just like if there was no boundary between two nations, then at what point would one nation have cause to arrest somebody that is crossing over a border illegally, or to take physical action against an invading force? I think in the modern context, in modern geographical concerns, we have become quite precise at identifying state boundaries. And in so doing, it's much easier for us to identify when somebody crosses that border. But I can imagine in days past where borders were not as precise, conflicts must have been such an interesting and bizarre experience. But certainly they are to this day as well. I think our geographical precision only goes so far. Perhaps it gives us a false conception, but at least it allows us to see a little bit better, something that's a little bit more absolute. But nonetheless, taking this analogy of transgression and of the restraints that give the boundary its identity, we can say, we are now within this landscape. Now again, there's no illustration here. Now I've been giving a few different illustrations, like crossing over a border, and then I gave the example of liberty. See, it's almost impossible not to give an experiential or observable illustration. It almost doesn't work if it's not placed in the world. But let's find ourselves here in a controlled environment. Okay, let's be a little scientific in the sort of ironic sense, since it's just happening in my mind. Let's imagine ourselves in the Arizona desert. This is our scientific laboratory. Now, I say the Arizona desert because I'm imagining just sort of a really dry and arid, flat landscape. And perhaps you and I are out there, and we find ourselves some identifiable border. Perhaps in the earth, the crust is broken apart to form two distinct and separate areas. Now, within our immediate experience, we are able to identify the two, at least with the boundary, certainly we can identify, but we are able to identify the separation, and therefore the two pieces of the earth that are separated. Now, if we walk up to this boundary and we walk over it, we could say in a certain sense that we have transgressed it. Now, there hasn't been much of an insult done here. Within this laboratory, it's well controlled. We have not crossed over some irreparable boundary with a mother-in-law or something, right? We've just walked ourselves over this dry piece of land to the other dry piece of land. But in this instance, and we will run into an issue here in a moment, but in this instance, we have not passed over the transgression. We have just transgressed. Now, an interesting thing is, where do we identify the transgression? It's within the act, it's within the behavior, it's within the decision. It's within this relationship of things that have occurred to cause the transgression to occur. It's sort of a snapshot, just like committing a crime where one has done something unlawful. There's an incident in which somebody has committed that crime. That unlawful behavior has been set in stone by some witness. Some party can submit to a court some grounds for an argument such that one has transgressed that boundary, which is the law. And yet, we have not overcome the transgression until we have come to a conclusion, but the conclusion itself has restraints. The conclusion rests within the three pillars that I've been discussing: the hearth, the divine peak of the mountain, and the heavenly staircase. It involves a sacrifice such that one can transcend, because once they transcend, then they now exist at a higher plane for which they can move over that transgression. Now, if we imagine like a 3 dimensions, whereas if you just transgress the boundary, you're more or less in the same dimension. But if you transcend, you're well above. Perhaps we can say, I'm not sure if this is precise or not, but we could say that you're in a different dimension, right? In a different dimension such that your relationship to the transgression is now different. You are no longer so, now I don't want to say involved, because certainly you're involved, but the degree to which that immediacy of transgression has caused the anger, perhaps, let's say, just for the sake of argument, it's righteous anger. There is something within the sacrifice and the transcendence that has dissipated the anger. And that, I think, to me, is interesting. That would make an interesting painting. So of this problem to solve, that of the transcendence and its relationship to the transgression, how it dissolves the potential spiritedness, I guess I could say, although that's not a very precise word, perhaps I could say the emotional side of that we're certainly seeing in this verse. The discretion of a man defers his anger, and it is his glory to pass over transgression. That then implying if the man did not have discretion, he would be quite angry at the transgression. But again, the matter of transcendence. If we move up on that heavenly staircase beyond the transgression, we are not moving beyond the boundary. The boundary has been set for some reason. I think what the transcendence affords us is a reorientation. It is a moment of reorientation. Now, the sacrifice and the process by which one undergoes the process of transformation and thereby transcendence is, I think, a reorientation and the introduction of precision into the establishment of the boundary. Now, in some sense, I could say it's an establishment of a new boundary, but in some sense that's false. It could be true insofar as the two parties don't really adequately understand why that boundary is in place, or exactly where the boundary is. The process, ideally, if two parties are involved, two individuals, we can imagine any number of scenarios with any number of parties. We can imagine a majority on one side and a minority on another. The possibilities are many. But just assuming for the moment that we have two singular individuals. One potential path to solution is through the discourse between these individuals. Now, this is not always possible because of the emotional barriers. It's possible for one party to have the conversation within himself or herself. And I think that conversation has to be in orientation to something. It cannot just be, like I've talked about, that soup of relativism. The boundaries, on one hand, we can say are relative. On the other hand, we cannot say they are relative. They are structural. On one hand, we could say that the placement of a house, the building of a neighborhood, the placement is relative. On another hand, we can say, no, it's quite deliberate where we placed it, but more importantly, the structure of the house is not relative. It is deliberate such that it stands, it doesn't fall. It is based on solid foundations. There are layers that we have to sort through in order to come to an adequate understanding of the relationship of the elements to that of the orienting structure, which is that divine logos, the peak of the mountain, or God. Now, as one can see quite clearly in this relationship, it's better if both parties are involved honestly, if they have the same faith, we can say. But again, if that is not the case, then one man can have the conversation within himself relative to that centerpiece. It doesn't mean he'll be correct, but it means that he is committed to the pursuit of transcendence, the pursuit of discernment, of discretion. Now, this setting aside of the anger, I think is more of a sacrifice rather than putting aside for another day. But insofar as the emotion of anger itself, it is a type of deferment, because anger will still exist in the heart of man no matter how pious he is, no matter how many transgressions he has reflected upon. There will always be a scenario for which that part of him will be stimulated, and that stimulation isn't negative. It's an opportunity rather than the falling into the base desire, falling into the desires of the heart, or that thing that is beyond the direction of his less immediate, more discerning self. It is that part of him that wishes to take the road that is less considerate. It is the result of an ill-tempered heart. Now, the degree to which our man in question, or the two parties in question, are able to come to a conclusion is the degree to which they are able to sacrifice such that they see the problem more clearly. And one has to wonder exactly what the end goal is. Is it the case that in every situation, what transcendence offers us is unification? Is it the case that there is a possibility that transcendence involves disunity? I think both are true. Again, I think it's dependent upon the circumstance, but not dependent upon complete relativism. It's dependent upon the circumstance relative to that divine central peak. Now, this verse has done well to reorient us to that image of transgression and of the transcendence above it, and the prompting to think about the potential ways in which the putting aside of superficial behaviors, falling into the heart, as I've said, or falling into disunity of the heart with the mind, or perhaps the inability of both to rise above this situation and the circumstance. I think we can admit that even righteous or justified anger can pollute judgment. And insofar as there is a polluting element to our judgment, we ought to understand how to temper it. And temperance through transcendence, I think, is the appropriate path forward for man when he finds himself faced with a dilemma. Now, this verse has been seen before, and I'm sure that we will see it again before the end of the book of Proverbs. And so I'll leave that verse there for now. The king's wrath is as a roaring of a lion, but his favor is as dew upon the grass. So we have a few different illustrations here, a few different symbols. So let's start with the first instance. The king's wrath is as the roaring of a lion. So we have to pick apart this roaring lion. Now, of a roaring lion, it's powerful, it's deep, it's loud, it spreads over vast distances. In fact, the roaring of a lion can be heard up to 5 miles away. And so insofar as we are relating this to a king's wrath, we can say that it is expansive. It spreads over wide distances. It's loud. It is loud in the sense that the response that is born of that wrath or that extreme anger will be heard by many people. But his favor is as dew upon the grass. Now, dew upon the grass, this is sort of a sweet analogy. Now, what causes this dew on the grass? This process of the formation of dew is through condensation. From a higher temperature to a lower temperature. In the higher temperatures, the air is saturated with water vapor. As the temperature decreases, that vapor it condenses to form the water molecules that are seen. And I think the king and the position that he holds, this high position in human society, much of his authority is unseen. If we just were in the presence of the king, much of what he is accountable for, responsible for, is beyond our immediate perception. Just like in the case of the water vapor, that is sort of pre-dew before the temperatures have dropped. Much of many things are beyond our perception. And it is not until a change in circumstance or the favor of the king, or that drop in temperature, then are we allowed, or are we able to perceive that dew upon the grass, that physical form. And so in the example, in the illustration of the king, certainly this is the appropriation, perhaps, the condensation of material that is otherwise imperceptible by the person in question. The king possesses the authority, or possesses this sort of condensation-like mechanism in order to grant favors, in order to exert his influence on his subjects. Now, regarding the fractal structure that I speak of often, that repeating pattern that can appear at different levels, we could speak of the king, we could speak of God as occupying that place of authority. We could just as easily say the Lord's wrath is as a roaring lion, but his favor is as dew upon the grass. I think the same thing is true there. Moreover from that, I think that this proverb has many interpretations. The potential for many interpretations is there. Now, some characteristic of dew that is quite easily observable. I wouldn't consider myself to be much of a dew expert, but in my reflection upon the experience of seeing it, it is something that doesn't last very long. Now, the grass may remain wet for some time before the sun evaporates that moisture, and it returns to a vapor, or it's dispersed in the air. I think just as this dew can be seen as a condensation of the heavenly down to the material, as sort of a positive thing, it could also be seen as a temporary thing. That the condensation of the heavenly substrate, as it moves down to the material world, perhaps through the human being, depending on the context or the illustration, it is something that will not last forever. And that's something that we always have to keep in mind. So we keep in mind both that God, the King, his wrath is well outside of our own experience. It's easy to get caught up in selfishness. It's easy to get caught up in wickedness such that we are unable to see the world as it is, reality as it is. There is difficulty with understanding the perception of man in relation to the structure of reality, and also an additional complication is the introduction of selfhood, or the self-consciousness, into the equation of an imperfect machine that is trying to interpret a reality that surrounds it. We can imagine all of the potential situations in which man can find himself in a delusion. And the Proverbs do well to point out this case. And it's not just the Proverbs build slowly over time, warning continually of the dangers of the self. We find this in the Psalms, we find this in many places. And so just as we experience the world, we can imagine a world that is experienced absolutely, that does not have the same problems that we do, that does not have the same issues with the relationship of the heart to that of the reasoning directed aspect to that of the broader whole, which might be considered the soul. This being that does not have the issue of the individual's relationship to the material world, or the individual's relationship to other individuals, or the individual's relationship to the institutions that they create. we can see how imperfect nodes in a structure that is governed by physical law, that is, partially perceivable by those individuals, how this can go wrong quite quickly. And there's a number of things that my mind thinks about here. The current state of the world, on the precipice of war, and it's a lot if one finds themselves in a position of contemplation of it. It can be quite distracting from everyday life. And yet, of everyday life, those who do not pay attention to that which is above them, they are diminished themselves. And yet again, we find ourselves in a situation of balance and orientation. The previous verse, of course, this was a verse of balance and of orientation to the line that is transgressed. A foolish son is the calamity of his father, and the contentions of a wife are a continual dropping. Now, this is a verse that we've seen before in slightly different language. What's interesting about the Proverbs is that I've seen a gradual progression from the self, a lot of Proverbs on the self, and they don't quite cease, but they pull back a little bit, and I think what's introduced is a little bit more relational. Of course, it involves the self because it is in relation to something else or somebody else. But now there's a prompting beyond. We've been warned sufficiently about the dangers of selfishness. Every once in a while we get a reminder, hey, think about this again. But now we've been continually prompted to think about the orientation outward and that scale, that Russian doll phenomenon, that fractal structure, that repeating pattern that goes larger and larger and larger, smaller and smaller, smaller, the form staying the same throughout. A foolish son is the calamity of his father. Of the fool we have discussed. This is the silly, the inattentive, the unlawful, the person who lacks judiciousness, the person, I think of the pit of Sheol here, this place of darkness that is the home for both the living and of the dead. This condition of man that thinks more of himself, less of things outside of himself. He does not think or concern himself with relation. If he does, it's always on the surface. There is no attempt to find himself deeper. Of work, it is difficult for him because he cannot pay attention, and so forth and so on. This is the nature of the foolish person. A foolish son is the calamity of his father. Now this is true because the foolish person is unable to properly provide for himself and make adequate decisions. Like I said, he is a poor judge. He has difficulty finding the truth. And this causes a burden to the man that brought him into the world. Now the second half of this verse, following in a similar vein of the family and of efficiency, of growth, of unity. Contention is some heavy disagreement, some dispute. an argument, some discord, some variance. Now, a contention in and of itself, I think it implies a type of argument. Like I said, it's a heated argument. It is a very passionate one. And as we have learned of verse 11, the discretion of a man defers his anger, and it is his glory to pass over a transgression. Such situations in which the contentions of the wife or of the husband provide continual droppings is certainly a situation in which the transgression has not been passed over, that the contentions continue without resolution. And the word dropping is interesting there, because if one is to drop something, on one hand, it could be to leave something, but it's not necessarily, of course, to leave the passions or to leave the argument. I don't think that's what it's implying. To drop something in this sense, in relation to the verse, if we are to stay with, to leave, to set aside, it is to set aside the principle of Passover. Secondly, dropping, more importantly, an interpretation of that word is to move from one state to the state below, like a physical position, a state higher to a state lower. And then if we think of our transcendent staircase, and if we think about the hearth, the discussions around the hearth have not yielded the type of advancement that it is designed to be there for. The tradition around which the family structure revolves has been insulted in such a way because of the behavior of the individuals that it is unable to function. The staircase has, the individuals have descended on that staircase rather than ascended. They have brought themselves to a greater degree of confusion, perhaps willfully so. This is an extension of foolish behavior. Contention and foolishness, I think, go quite well together. And so we can see that in such a failure in both of the situation of the son and in the case of the wife or of the contentious husband, the very truth-seeking apparatus that our traditional structure, that of, we bind through marriage, we orient ourselves in a similar geographical location, we do certain things together, we come together for certain reasons, we eat together, all of this sort of stuff, it is designed to be put in place in order to facilitate. In a like manner, we have children in order to facilitate. We facilitate our propagation of our seed into the future. We do so to enhance love and connectedness in our life. But of course, regardless of the institution is but a tool. The individual can use a tool for anything. The hammer can be used as a weapon. The hammer can be used. It can be just not used. But in the case of its use as a weapon rather than use as a tool of building, we can see that it has the opposite effect, especially under conditions of contention, of malice, of variance. Now, this is not to say that disagreement or argument are inappropriate. This is something that is going to happen regardless around that hearth. But it is the way that the family conducts themselves and utilizes the tools that are given to them that matters. And there is no difficulty in understanding why one gets married, the potentials for adversity has not decreased. It is something of it's an acceptance of a responsibility. If those who engage in that institution are unable or unwilling to accept their responsibilities, they will find themselves falling down rather than standing up. House and riches are the inheritance of fathers, and a prudent wife is from the Lord. Now, in some sense, what I see here is order and mobility are the inheritance of fathers. No, it's more than that. A house is more than just order. Because, of course, if we talk about this hearth at the center of the house, it's not necessarily something that is order. It is an axiom. It is an axiom by which the process by which some order comes to be circulates or rotates around. And exactly how to, summarize that with one word, house is a pretty good example, but house in and of itself, I think it needs this illustration so that it could be placed within the verse, so that it can mean something to me, I suppose. But this capacity that the house offers, this sort of like what comes to mind is the replication of DNA. Not necessarily in the sense of the offspring, although perhaps there is a parallel to be drawn there, but more so a replication of a type of order, a type of structure, which DNA is. It is that structure by which, that fundamental structure by which things, cellular development, broad-scale characteristics are determined, the code by which all that is determined. Within this house, I think we have, again, just much like the hearth, that is this axiom by which the process of growth, of development, of establishing order, all of this develops. It is a creative place. It's a workshop. Now, the workshop, a successful workshop, a workshop that can actually produce things, must contain a humble author, perhaps we can say, one that is committed to his craft, that craft of raising, developing, establishing a family. And the riches are something that I wouldn't necessarily say is secondary. It is perhaps parallel to the house, but the riches are, to an extent, analogous to mobility, in the sense that riches can come in a material form that allows us to participate in the world with more fluidity, thereby more mobility. We aren't as encumbered by the forces that be, the structures that may otherwise limit our growth, limit our development, or perhaps not even going there, but limit our movement. And I don't necessarily mean to imply here some force of antagonism, or perhaps I should say more precisely some force of evil, some negativity that is purposely against an individual. But just by virtue of circumstance, man can find himself with all sorts of constraints that can be freed and lifted given what we consider to be riches and a house. Now, both of these words, I think, in the metaphorical sense, we have a much more expansive view. In the material sense, we have some understanding. House and riches are the inheritance of fathers. Now, on one hand, the fathers that these things, this order, mobility, the possibility that workshop is not only handed down to the father that hands down to the son, but it is something, again, that is just not limited to one singular individual. At least it doesn't have to be. There are plenty of situations where it is limited, but by whatever reason the line ends or a cycle breaks such that new possibilities occur. But I think in relation to the verse here, what we are talking about is the passing down of this tradition and the opportunity. A prudent wife is from the Lord. Now, this is a difficult one. It's difficult in a few different ways, I suppose. You know, the period that we find ourselves in, that we live in today, after the, I'm not sure if we can call ourselves post-progressive era, or if we are still in it. Perhaps we are still in it, but moving away from. The peak has been passed. But the point is, the progressive era has led to many changes of previous social norms. And I think that it can be difficult to understand exactly where to place certain verses in the modern context. A prudent wife is from the Lord. Now, certainly these days we have the institution of marriage. I don't think it's as strong as it once was, or as socially ingrained as it once was, both in terms of its structure, but also in terms of its ubiquitousness, or ubiquity. The roles of men and women have changed socially. The fundamentals, of course, remain the same. We have this liberatory sense, a progressive sense of the roles of women in modern-day society. And yet her responsibilities from a purely female standpoint remain the same. The things that she must consider when she chooses a mate, when she decides to have children. The process that she goes through, the experience that she has a profound impact on the rest of society and of the family. Now, prudence is certainly a virtuous quality. It is to a degree of what I have just described. It describes a person that is cautious, judicious. They show good judgment. They think about the future. They are wise. And I think that there is something inherent about the female condition and her responsibilities that prompts her to be wise, again, just by virtue of her form in her relationship to the world and other human beings. Now, of course, we don't live within the world of ideal circumstances or situations or forms. We live in the world where we aspire to ideals. And of the Lord, of this divine light, of this place by which things are properly ordered, that they have this unceasing, truthful dynamism for which man can only envy. I think that for this verse to say that a prudent wife is a gift from God is to say that this prudence, when placed in the female form, again given this disposition towards a natural disposition towards prudence, once she has accepted that, and she has within herself understood her responsibilities and taken it upon herself to think of the possibilities, I think it's a gift because of not only the direction that she can steer society in, but also because of the relationship that she can develop with the mate that she chooses. Now, of the directedness of society, she directs not only with selection in terms of selecting a mate, but she also directs it in terms of the care and the nourishment, the upbringing of her offspring. Of course, in conjunction with the male, but again, the female is the receiving element. It is one that is prone to this prudence. Now, I'll have to admit that I am not as versed as I should be in the relation of the sexes. But of the Proverbs, I think we have an interesting conception of the female, and it is associated with wisdom. I've talked some about the divine feminine. I have come to certain conclusions that are difficult to draw just off the cuff. But sticking with her lot in life, I think with her, as I've sort of alluded to, there comes, with her experience in the world, within her capacity to receive the seed of the future, let's say, she has, again, a sort of a built-in proverb, a natural orientation towards the selective, towards the future, again. You know, another interesting illustration is if we zoom out from the individual experience and we take the three pillars that we have established so far, the mountain, transcendent staircase, the hearth, and again we zoom out past the individual and we examine, just as we examine the individual's life, his relationship to the peak of that mountain, what he does, what he chooses to surrender, what he chooses to sacrifice in order to transcend, to move up on that staircase, his formation and his relation to some sort of hearth within his social sphere, whatever sphere that he finds himself within, how he orients himself to the rest of the human experience. Outside of all of that, and we imagine sort of the collective human experience, I think it is more a predisposition of the feminine to see in these terms rather than that of the individual. And I think it is because of this disposition that whole picture view. It is part of what makes her wise, or what prompts her towards that wisdom. Now, of course, this does not mean that men are inherently selfish, or men don't consider the bigger picture. I'm speaking, of course, in terms of the presentation of nature. There are many callings that go on deaf ears. And the thing that's interesting is to imagine the discontinuity between the individual and the collective. And yet the collective is its own thing. It has its own relationship to that of the individual. It is something that the individual can work on. It is something that the collective can inhabit, if the individuals that make it up are so discerning, or if they are judicious. But after every life, or perhaps within every life, and as new life begins, and as it is brought up, things are not always the same. It's not as though we are laying down a train track, one rung in front of another. We don't seem to traverse the conscious landscape in this way. But rather this slow, mechanical, methodical experience, we are more like a flood of light, both destroying, but also cunningly swift is not the right word, cunningly adaptive. I think adaptive is the right word. Adaptive to the landscape, just like water is adaptive to the surface that it is poured over. It continually spreads out. Light, obviously, is a very good example. Light and the darkness. It just seems to spread out in all different directions. Now, in a sense, there is this methodical advance, the advance of the light. Of course, the light can go out. But so far, in terms of the human experience, it hasn't. We still remain. And certainly we have kept with us the experience of others, which helps us see the surrounding landscape more clearly, because the light is brighter. In all of this, the woman surely finds herself. She has to imagine how to carry the potential source of new light forward into the world and into the future. Now, of course, if she's prudent, she thinks in this way. She has this concern. Now, there are women, of course, that don't think this way. I'm not here to judge, of course, but the thing is, the conception between that divine feminine and that of the human fallen feminine requires the virtues of that apply equally to that of the male form, to that of the female. I suppose I'm approaching the end of what I have to say about this verse. But as I've discussed, and as what has been unfolding here throughout the Proverbs has been an experience of orientation and of relationship, introducing that specific element, the female, where she finds herself in relation to this earth, and that divine staircase in terms of the collective, perhaps collective across the board, the collective earth, the collective staircase, the collective peak of that mountain. Her experience, her prudence, is quite interesting to reflect on. And that's something I think surely we will see again. Now, when I mentioned the issue of the progressive era, the issue, I think, is within the relations. It's a relation between man and woman. It is the relationship between woman and the social order. It's the relationship of the woman and her responsibility. And it's such a strange thing to watch and to observe abortion as a highly contested political pawn. Unfortunate. Interesting, but also unfortunate. For a woman to find herself in a situation such that she even considers to sacrifice the life of a child. Now, the situation is made more difficult when a child is brought to bear outside of her will, but that aside, my opinion really doesn't change, but that aside, her willingness to sacrifice that life that has started, the seed that has continued, that has begun to grow, shows a shift, I would have to think, or at least a particular type of view that I would have to imagine damages the virtue of prudence as it has made its way and marched its way into the modern era. And I think it would do us some good to somehow reintroduce a national hearth by which we can really communicate these issues as it applies to the human being, rather than for superficial political games, political theater. Slothfulness casteth into a deep sleep, and an idle soul shall suffer hunger. Now this verse is quite penetrating. It's penetrating because I think it's difficult to be satisfied. It's difficult to be satisfied rightly. And I think in our pursuit of satisfaction, we often appeal to that aspect of satisfaction that is most immediate, most gratifying, easiest to obtain. And even without all of the flood of information and of distracting material that exists in the modern world, just in a primitive sense, there are plenty of things that we can fall back on, behaviors that we can fall back on that are unproductive, states of mind that are unproductive, that can lead us to that pit of Sheol, that darkness. The darkness is that place for which we have abandoned attentiveness. We have sacrificed attentiveness in return for some superficial gratification. Sometimes I think the trade is not so cut and dry. I think it could be more, it could be much deeper. But perhaps it amounts to the same thing. What changes is one's understanding of the superficial. As they understand a greater and greater depth, what appears to them to be at the surface grows also. And so, on one hand, one individual can understand superficiality quite superficially. And the relationship to the depth, to the source, can be poor, can be immature. And yet another person can find themselves understanding quite deeply about things, and yet engage in behavior that perhaps would still be considered superficial to some, and yet quite prestigious and disciplined to others. And this is not to say that this is relative in the absolute sense. It is to say that the soul of man is dynamic. And perhaps there is something, I think, farther that we can say to prevent us from falling into a sense of nihilism because of our own limitations, of not being able to see the depths, and perhaps when we understand the depths, we can't fully get there because of the pressure, I think, of an ocean. I think of the vast depths that some parts of the ocean possess. We can understand it, we can measure it, but at some point we just cannot experience it fully without being crushed by the pressure of the water. In a like manner, perhaps it would be, being crushed by the amount of information that there is to hold in the mind. At a certain point, the fuse just sort of breaks. It doesn't hold up to that sort of thing. It is not an excuse to continue and to transcend. Through transcendence, I think we open new doors. But limitation is something that is real. So today marks a new day, perhaps a break in the continuity of my previous thought, but I want to jump back into this verse here. And I want to start with this slothfulness. And before I jump into the definition, I would like to say that I think that slothfulness is something that we all struggle with. I myself certainly struggle with this. And I think that it's easy to find oneself in a state of excessive, perhaps judgment or self how can we say it, placing high pressure on oneself because of one's failures or because of one's disinclination. And I think it's, on one hand, it's a simple matter, but on the other hand, it is quite a complex matter to solve the issue of slothfulness. Now, the definition of this slothfulness is a disinclination to work or exert oneself. It is a hesitancy, indisposition, a reluctance. And how many times throughout the day do we experience this? Surely it's quite easy to avoid this sort of thing if we are absorbed in work, when we are in that flow state. I think there are generally these two types of characters in my mind. On one hand, you have the type that perhaps they do not find themselves inclined to work. Perhaps they are lazy, perhaps they're not lazy, but they just don't have a purpose for which they are driven. On the other hand, you have those that are perhaps either they're lazy or they are just industrious and disciplined, such that they commit themselves to work no matter what it is. And when I say lazy, I think there can be an element of laziness for which an industrious person can possess. That is, a laziness of thinking. A laziness of thinking that although they are disciplined in terms of getting out of bed and going and working all day, perhaps 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, whatever it is, they do so to prevent themselves from focusing on certain things that ought to be solved. Certain personal dilemmas, perhaps an issue at home in which they work so that they can avoid it. Now, surely this is a type of laziness. It's a laziness that is shrouded with the veneer, or perhaps not the veneer, but the, we could say veneer, deception of hard work. And certainly there is hard work there. Now, what makes this difficult, I think, is perhaps I can't speak for everybody here in every particular example, but I can speak for myself. The camp that I find myself in is the disinclined because of a moral dilemma. That is not that I do not like work, but it is a hesitancy to exert oneself for something that is uncertain. And I think that this produces slothfulness, because hesitancy in and of itself is a lack of decision-making, a lack of action, which leads to inaction, certainly. And there's great danger in it. I think it's better for somebody to be in the camp of the industrious and yet blind, perhaps, camp than that of the hesitant and overly philosophically inclined. Sometimes I find it difficult to understand my place in the world, and my place in the institutions. I think we find ourselves in an era of profound uncertainty. Again, the word that comes to mind is domicide. And within this domicide, within the destruction of the home, the destruction of the hearth, there is a profound insecurity. And there is an ease to fall back on the material comforts of life. Much like one may fall back on the pursuit of money to solve all of their issues, that superficial distinction of wealth. And they keep themselves occupied so they don't have to deal with the things that truly matter to the human being. That of connection, of family, of raising strong children. But I think, regardless of the circumstance, slothfulness will find us. And when it does, it is always a personal problem. It is something that we all have to work through. And on one hand, there is the no-nonsense approach, which I think is quite effective, but it denies that sustaining element, perhaps. It denies the problems and the issues that one faces. Now, the irony, I think, is in some cases the dilemmas of a person's life can be solved by engaging in productive behavior. And over time, just the pure act of participation and experience will gradually unfold the knots that had prevented them from acting in the world. Now, for my own part, I think that the situation of my life, I find myself in an in-between. There are things that I have achieved, and yet it is at the precipice for which life is about to change quite dramatically. And we all go through this. Every person, they find themselves at different stages of life and different changes for which they have to adapt to and they have to understand and navigate. To avoid that perversion of slothfulness, I think, is one of the utmost concerns. And it is so because of what this verse prompts us to reflect on, that of being cast into a deep sleep. And if we reflect on the nature of what a deep sleep is, it is a lack. It is a lacking of wakefulness. It is a lacking of attention. It is a lacking of presence. Sleep is such a bizarre thing that we spend such a long amount of time in that state. Certainly it's a necessary state, but when we expand the analogy out, say sleep, and apply it to the conscious state, it becomes a negative. But why is it negative? Of course, I've discussed the inattention. I've discussed the lack of direction, the consciousness. Perhaps this is something for each individual to answer. But insofar as there is a universal answer, the experience of man comes to mind here. The purpose of his existence comes to mind here. Now, of the different classes of men, I can imagine that of the slave. And of the gradations of conscious experience through which I think are modified by the responsibilities that he chooses to accept in life, that of the slave is at the bottom of that rung. He finds himself in that state of sleepiness, that sleepfulness. The slave, although he is responsible for things, his independence, the burden of his liberation, is not his to bear. He belongs to somebody else. And what exactly constitutes slavery, I think, is a difficult thing to describe. Because surely, I think about this in the modern context, surely we have situations in which man's liberation that was intended by the philosophical pursuits of the American Revolution have been distorted and perverted such that a man may perceive himself to be free and yet be completely owned, perhaps, or deluded into the understanding that he is actually free. Liberation itself is a difficult thing. Both the restraints that are necessary in society and also that liberatory element. It's a difficult tension, a dynamic tension, that's dependent upon the circumstance and the nature of the institutions that man has created for himself. And I think this circles back into the point that I was making earlier about that of the industrious person that consumes themselves or that is consumed in the work that they do. Now, people of this kind, I think, I shouldn't generalize, but it's easy to imagine one that is so absorbed, that is so focused on certain things that they don't care much about this liberatory sense. In a certain sense, that excessive focus on one's identity and liberation can prevent them from acting in the world. On the other hand, a man can find himself so absorbed in the day-to-day and be so accepting of the monotony that he doesn't recognize that his life is utterly controlled by certainly by forces, but it's not the forces that are the issue. Utterly controlled by other people. Now, it's a hard case to argue against, that no matter what society that we find ourselves in, that we are always going to be constrained by other people. And perhaps it's not necessarily the constraint that we ought to be concerned with, because there is a place for restraint and for constraints that are necessarily placed on every single person. Everybody has their own place, despite their identity, despite the want for their identity to be freed from the constraints of others. But it is a matter of orientation, because we do agree that there are certain constraints that institutions may place on the multitude or on a minority that are impious, that are wrong, that are sinful. And one has to wonder, as we find ourselves in the territory of the Platonic cave, rising from a state of inferior perception to that one that is superior, to see above that cave, one has to wonder if this is an experience of transcendence itself, that the painful process of dealing with this slothfulness, or just the pure extension of the slothfulness, that deep sleep, that when we find ourselves in the deepest of sleep, we are on the precipice of something new, of some wakeful cycle. And despite of the liberation of man as days passed, it is now that he finds himself at a new precipice upon that divine staircase for which he is prompted to ascend and rediscover that spirit of liberation. The spirit of liberation is something, in the good form, I think, that is properly aligned, that it recognizes proper constraints, but it also is judicious enough, discerning enough to understand where the inappropriate constraints are placed. And for man, all of this can seem so relative. But as a matter of faith, I believe that it is not. And it takes us some time, both by the natural expansion and progression. Perhaps progression is not the right word, but expansion might be expansion in the sense of the light of the mind, in which it finds itself into new territories. It may find itself in a material revolution, where it has found itself in a world of readily available products and life-saving medicines that have changed our experience in some way. His relationship and his orientation to the world now must be adjusted. The institutions change over time, both political but also corporate and cultural. Cultural attitudes change over time. Language changes over time. Scientific discoveries change. Our understanding of the material world constantly changes. And yet, at the same time, we have certain fundamentals that we hold dear. And perhaps, at the most poetic of periods of human existence, when those fundamental axioms are shifted, when they are questioned. When they are questioned by virtue of the circumstance, perhaps in the age, in the period of enlightenment that is afforded the human species, it is then that they are able to accept and see above and beyond and develop new fundamental axioms. Not that the old axioms were incorrect, they were correct for the place that they were. Their understanding of the world was correct for the information that they were able to take in and perceive. In the Platonic example, in the example of the cave, when the man is within the cave, all he can see are those shadows that are cast upon the wall. This is all he knows of the material world. It is not until he embarks and he is freed, he embarks on this journey out of the cave, up to the world in which it is not as low resolution as the one that was in the cave. As he finds himself in the new world, he is unable to experience it because of the light and the richness, the vastness of information. And he must acclimatize to it through the reflection that is within the water. The reflection itself is a reduced resolution of what he is going to later become acclimatized to. And I think the analogy extends beyond there. We have to wonder how many times it extends, how many times that we can actually transcend that experience and understand new things to such a degree. But as far as this process, and again, as far as the process of transcendence is concerned, our relationship to this changes. And this is what is difficult for me, because this is involved in slothfulness, it is involved with the characterization of the generations. In the United States, there is this constant antagonism between the generations that have come before and the generations that have come after. Certainly the generations during the technological revolution seem vastly different than the ones that have come before. There are many critiques given by the older generations of the new that are justified. There are many that are strange and lacking in character and in humility. And there are critiques on the side of the new generations that critique the old that I think that are accurate, but also at times infantile and naive. It makes me wonder exactly when the period will come in which we find the collective in a state of recognition of their sleepfulness, of their slothfulness. And when will they wake up to the fact that, given their inattention, both in the case of the one that is hesitant towards challenge, towards labor perhaps, and the other that is industrious, but also superficial, vain, and just as weak, when both of them will rise above their slumber and address the hand that has come over them, the improper hand, the hand of the institution that ought not to be over man, the hand that we recognize belongs to God and not to that of a particular human being or group of human beings. Slothfulness casteth into a deep sleep, and an idle soul shall suffer hunger. This is another great opportunity to go through the soul, what it means for that soul to be idle, and what it means to suffer hunger, because of course the soul is distinct from the body in certain respects. In some respect, we cannot separate it entirely. It is part of the identity of the whole. But in terms of the hunger, it is not a complete parallel to that of the physical hunger. And it's an interesting analogy to use, to take something as ethereal as the soul and to tie it to that physical analogy. But keeping in mind the deep sleep, keeping in mind the inattention, keeping in mind that self, the identity, the awareness of the self, but also the orientation of the self, not too absorbed within the self. Herein lies the problem. One can be completely unaware of one's own behavior because of the absorption within the self, but also within the absorption of their experience in the world. But one has to wonder if this is not the same thing in these cases. Perhaps one is the denial of the self, such that they cannot even identify their own experience, other than in cases of this hunger that we talk about. The hunger, in the sense, reminds us that this body is something that needs to be attended to. Now, if we think about it in this way, when the soul is hungry, we are reminded of that part of the self and of the individual that needs to be attended to, that is quite unique, quite individual. And so what I struggle with at the moment is, how do we separate that selfishness and perhaps the extreme denial of the self with the appropriate view of the self? Now, we've discussed this a lot in terms of wickedness, perhaps by extension evil, foolishness. And so this is something that, at this point, I'm well versed in. And yet, the question of balance is always a difficult one. And just like the hearth, perhaps a concrete example is not really what we are after. What we are after is that structure, that institutional structure that provides us a self-correcting mechanism, much like the judiciary is a filter for which those who are brought in front of the court are allowed to be heard. Their case is thought through, examined, and a decision is made based on a procedure. And so I think that this is an element of discerning between when one has fallen too far into the self or one has fallen too outside of the self, and such that they deny it. And so the thing is, well, if we can rely on external institutions to assist us in this process, much like we rely on the court or we rely on the church to bring us to some point, to some orientation, how can man himself create this institution within him, this filter within him, that allows him to regulate effectively? And that's easy. I mean, it's difficult. I don't know why I said easy. It's hard, given a number of one, without the jury, without the judge, without that external input. So perhaps the first part of the answer to this question is that it necessarily must involve other people It must involve that relationality. It is not an excuse, though, I think, to completely depend on those outside without taking responsibility for that self, that internal self, without having an adequate and discerning self-reflection, without taking on that responsibility of self-reflection, we could say. So we have found ourselves now in relation to the world. We are engaged. The first principle that we have arrived at here is this engagement with other people, such that we can gain information outside of ourselves. The second is that continual self-reflection, and by extension, I think the attempt, at least, at the honest self-reflection. And I think this is facilitated by the Proverbs. It's facilitated by various forms of literature, which I guess suppose is a degree of external input, but it's an individual pursuit. Now I can go further and say that this self-reflection, it can be it can be placed on a schedule, but I think as one places this on the schedule, they ought to become more in tune with when the self, the individual, needs that self-reflection, when the soul indeed becomes hungry. Or, I would say more sophisticated, in a more sophisticated sense, that when the soul becomes idle, and therefore it is wanting and in need, it has this hunger to it. So what exactly does it mean for the soul to be idle? What can we say of the soul? Thus far, I've been discussing the soul as something that is, in some sense, identifiable, separate from that of the heart, that of the spirit. It is the essence of a person, but we can say sort of the essence of a person consistent with the spirit as well. I think it is an encompassing thing that includes perhaps the heart and the spirit and the mind, the rational, directed sense. And of course the physical body, there is the relationship to that. Now what we are discussing here, I think, is the relationship between the spiritual and the material. The soul, in some sense, is distinct from that of the body. The soul is that immortal part of him, that eternal component that reflects the divine image. The divine image of man and of humanity. It is something that is invisible in the material sense, but it is perceivable. Now in the ancient sense, and perhaps the orthodox sense, the soul is described often in three parts. That of the gnosis, this intellect, the thumos, the will or that desiring aspect, or the epithumia, or passions, that appetite. Now, in my own conception, I think that I have recognized that rational component, the directed component. I have also recognized the passions, that of the heart. But of this will, I have attributed both to the heart and of the rational mind. That the heart has this sort of directedness to it, that is beyond just the rational mind. The rational mind is not the thing that controls all. It has a significant impact on that control. But the heart and its desires, perhaps I should be more specific here, the element of man by which we consider the heart to be, whatever scientific and anatomical explanation we want to use for it, it really doesn't matter. We can say of it the limbic, we could say of it the inputs that we get from the brainstem, sort of the autonomic components, and how we integrate that experience and the feelings that we get from all of the inputs from the receptors in the body. This substructure has a will of its own, insofar as there is the emanatory. Language is difficult here. That which comes down to us, that is felt, perhaps we could say, it's not rational. The feeling can be interpreted by the rational mind. Perhaps it could be accepted or rejected, but there is a will of its own within that experience. Just like in the rational mind, something can come to some conclusion completely independent of a feeling. It doesn't mean all feelings are wrong, but certainly some feelings can be deceptive. And in such a case, we find ourselves in prudent territory to accept the rationalization of the mind. And in that way, there's a direction of will there as well. And when we discuss the hunger of the soul, what the human being, I think, is thirsting for, or hungry for, is a reorientation to God. It is a reorientation to that source by which he can have confidence, perhaps in his beliefs, perhaps in his faith, but it's a confidence in his orientation to reality. It's a confidence that both what he perceives in the world is accurate, but also the steps that he takes and the will that he has is aligned such that he is, this is a tough one, he's integrated, but integrated, again, how does man know? But if man is to be this conscious being that is of and allowed to experience, because, or I should say further, that it has this ability to perceive and experience because of some fundamental source of being and of experience, of seeing, it is then his hunger and his desire to go back home to that thing of understanding, of knowing how things are, and his lack of understanding, his lack of orientation, his lack of alignment is the thing that produces within him a hunger. It may produce within him this sleepfulness, this inattentiveness, but perhaps the misalignment produces the anxiety that wakes him from the sleep. It is the step immediately proceeding, that of the behavior that had led him to that slothfulness. The hunger is a good thing. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to wake up, to be fed, to be nourished. He that keeps the commandment keeps his own soul, but he that despises his ways shall die. Now this verse proceeding here, this is verse 16, but I think this is directly related to verse 15. In the sense that, and insofar as he is able to recognize a true commandment, he is able to keep his soul, which means that he is able to retain the alignment to God, keep one's own soul is such an interesting expression, as if one can do something else other than keep the soul. It's an interesting prompting to reflect on the opposite, that antagonism there, in which man could lose the soul. He can, in a sense, that I can keep the coin in front of me in my pocket, It is something that is with me. But if I take it out, and perhaps I throw it or I spend it, it is now away from me. It is something that I no longer keep. It's something I no longer hold. Reflecting on something that is so fundamental as the soul in a like manner, it's quite a bizarre experience. To lose one's soul. Now, if this is not too unbecoming of me, I think about that song and the live performance of Alice in Chains, that Nutshell, for which the lead singer is describing how he feels in the lyrics. And of course, he died young, but you could tell that he says in the song that he's losing his soul. He's becoming so detached, so lost within the winds of time and of perspective and of experience that he can't orient himself anymore. He that has pity upon the poor lendeth unto the Lord, and that which he has given will he pay him again. Now, there are some verses that I have more trouble with than others. I think this one is one of those that is difficult for me to interpret. The language here is strange. He that has pity upon the poor lendeth to the Lord. Now, lend could be a loan, or it could be to give, and I think it makes more sense in this case to give. Now, as far as heaven and earth are concerned, I think man's existence, when fallen into a state of poverty, this pity, the sorrow, the empathy that is experienced on the part of the person who is willing to give, I think is raising a conscious mind up. It is bringing them towards that heavenly sphere. Perhaps insofar as we are assisting another filter, another mind that has the software to run reality and to experience reality, such that they flood light into an otherwise barren landscape. I think it is within this realm, the conscious agents of God's creation, or of that source's creation, as they assist each other. Perhaps there is this return to some rightful state, or a righteous state of mind, such that the ineffable is again perceivable, which was before then reduced by one state of poverty. Now, as I've said, I'm not too sure how to approach this verse. This is not an easy one. It's not readily understandable. Now, with that, I think I'm going to leave it here at the end of this part of chapter 19. I'll pick it up next time with verse 18.